Hi. Um, the title of this talk is Psychosis a Distinct Mode of Consciousness? And I'm going to begin with a story. Your thoughts are being heard, so you must control them very tightly. You are the second coming, and the problem is the pride that wells up with that thought. The whole planet depends on your thoughts remaining pure. If the pride wells up, the world will be cast into Armageddon. You keep thinking, it's me. But when that happens, you hear a crowd booing in your head. Your thoughts are being heard, and you must remain humble. Sounds in the environment are responses to your thoughts. If you have a bad thought, you can hear a siren in the distance. Sometimes there's the sound of car horns beeping. This is a positive sign. It means that the elders, the beings that are guiding you, are sending you a signal and are telling you they are with you, protecting you. With your thoughts, you control the anger of your mother who is driving the car. You telepathically communicate with her and try to send her good images of the past. You can feel the anger in the way the car is being driven. You must stay calm and control your thoughts. Everything in the environment, the sound of cars, sometimes angry, the sound of wind, lights flashing, sirens, car beeps, everything is a response to the thoughts you are having. Sometimes you get good signals, encouraging you, telling you that you're not alone. Sometimes the signals are scary when your thoughts stray and become hubristic. Everything becomes significant. When the car in front has its left indicator light flashing, it means you're meant to turn left. You panic because it's important to follow the right path. This is an initiation test, and it requires you ending up at the venue where you'll be met by these higher beings. But by the time you reach the hospital, you realize that nothing is that literal. The beings are with you, jumping into the bodies of people around you and communicating with you. The doctor at the hospital talks to you, and his personality changes depending on which eye you look into. In one eye, he's part of the initiation and knows what's going on, and you can hear the cheering and booing. In the other eye, he's just someone who's unaware of the enormous process that's taking place, unaware that the earth could plummet into Armageddon. You know that you're the second coming. You know that the fate of humanity rests on your shoulders. It depends on you thinking small, staying humble. It depends on you successfully completing this initiation test, reaching the end, and finding the souls who are guiding you. This describes my second psychotic episode that happened in 1993 when I was 23. And my work is motivated by a desire to understand this episode and two others like it that I had in my 20s. My approach to understanding psychosis differs from the dominant biomedical model. I try to understand psychosis by understanding the ways that consciousness can vary. And my goal is to take the first person experience of psychosis seriously and to see how our understanding of consciousness can shed light on this experience. So just an outline of my talk. I'll begin with some background. Then I'll discuss what is meant by levels of consciousness, because this is a problematic term. And then I'll look at my main question here, which is psychosis a distinct mode of consciousness? Okay, so my work's a philosophical attempt to understand psychosis within the framework of the science of consciousness. Psychosis refers to experiences that include features like hallucinations, delusions, and disordered thoughts. And it's a symptom of illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. We haven't found any biological markers for these illnesses yet. So when psychiatrists diagnose patients, they rely on lists of symptoms. We don't know what causes these disorders. As a result, we need novel approaches to classify them and to better understand them. Some background into consciousness. When I use the term consciousness, I mean phenomenal consciousness or our subjective first-person experience. For example, if you look at a red apple, the red has a certain quality. If you bite into the apple has a certain taste. So our subjective first-person experience has a qualitative and subjective aspect. There's something it is like to have these experiences. And consciousness can vary along numerous dimensions. So in my work, I look at 4 broad categories for understanding how consciousness can vary. And these include level of arousal and how we experience the contents of consciousness, the structure of consciousness, which includes time, attention, unity in the self, and functions of consciousness, which has to do with how the contents of consciousness, how accessible they are to certain systems in the brain that look after things like decision making and memory consolidation and those sort of things. I'll be going into these dimensions in greater detail later in the talk. Okay, when I say a mode of consciousness, when a creature is conscious, it must be conscious in a particular way. And these are called background states or global states or modes of consciousness. And they include things like the normal waking state, REM sleep, the state of being under light anesthetic, or altered states that are experienced due to the use of psychedelics. The method I'm using to look at this research question is some qualitative work I've done. So I've done 8 interviews with people who are 18 and over and have had at least one psychotic episode. And I've interviewed these people for an hour each over Zoom and asked them to describe their last psychotic episode. So my research for my PhD has 2 parts. The first part is a quantitative online survey, and I haven't analysed that data yet. And the second part is going to be 15 of these interviews. And I'm using some of the data from the 8 interviews I've done to illustrate how I'm trying to answer this research question in the later part of this talk. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about levels of consciousness now and why this is a problematic term. I said that consciousness was multidimensional. I agree with Bain and Hovey that it's multidimensional, but in the clinical literature, so clinicians working with brain damage patients, as well as scholars working on the neural correlates of consciousness, often understand consciousness as having 2 dimensions. And this quote is how consciousness is commonly understood. Consciousness is a multifaceted concept that has 2 dimensions: arousal or wakefulness, that is level consciousness, and awareness, that is content of consciousness. So this diagram is a way that consciousness is commonly understood by clinicians. And this diagram has 2 axes, but for simplicity, just concentrate on the horizontal axis, which is level of wakefulness or arousal. So we go from a coma, which is unconscious, deep sleep, light sleep, drowsiness, normal waking state. And the idea is that you increase your level of consciousness, so you become more conscious as you go through those various ways of being conscious. And in this sense, clinicians see consciousness as being gradable in terms of levels. We can't actually measure how conscious a person is objectively, but there are some measurements that clinicians use that track variables that correlate with dimensions of consciousness. So one of these is the perturbational complexity index, or the PCI, and this measures how interconnected different brain areas are, which correlates with level of arousal. Clinicians also use the Glasgow Coma Scale, and this tracks how responsive patients are to verbal commands. So I said clinicians think that you can rank these different ways of being conscious in a determinate ordering, but Bain, Hovey, and Owen argue that consciousness can't be ranked like that because it's multidimensional. An example is given by Bain and Carter, who compare the psychedelic state to the normal state of consciousness. And they're saying that the psychedelic state isn't a higher state. And what they do is they compare these 2 states along the dimension of perception and sensation, cognitive function, and the experience of unity. And whilst the psychedelic state, you'll have heightened perception and sensation, but your cognitive functioning will be diminished. So in that sense, you can't rank these 2 states. Another example is given by a paper by Jonathan Birch and his colleagues who look at animal consciousness. And they argue that you can't rank different species in a determinate ordering because consciousness is multidimensional. And they give the example, a hypothetical example of corvids, cephalopods, and elephants. And I'll look at that example in a moment in a bit more detail. Andrew Lee argues that despite consciousness being multidimensional, you can still rank it. So he gives the example of fruit is multidimensional. It has height, depth, and breadth. So a banana is longer than an apple, but an apple is wider than a banana. But if you compare an apple to a blueberry, the apple's going to be bigger. And arguably, you could use that comparison with states of consciousness and say that a psychedelic state is going to involve more consciousness than being under light anesthetic because it's going to score higher on these various dimensions. For example, there'll be more contents of consciousness and those contents will be richer, for example. But despite this, it still seems likely that there are going to be different modes or ways of being conscious that can't be ranked in a determinate ordering and different species of animals that can't be ranked. Before I talk about animal consciousness, I'll just do some conceptual clarifications. So the difference between levels and dimensions: height has one dimension and it can be measured in terms of levels or degrees. So when clinicians think of consciousness, they're often thinking of it as having this one dimension of arousal or wakefulness that can be measured in terms of levels. But the argument is that consciousness is more like health than height. So health is multidimensional. My husband's cholesterol is lower than mine, and in that sense, he's healthier. My blood pressure is lower than his, and in that sense, I'm healthier. So to work out who's healthiest overall, you need to take all of these dimensions into consideration and find a scale to work out who's healthiest. Okay. Another confusion: levels and modes are not synonymous. So when clinicians talk about these different ways of being conscious and call them levels, they're assuming they differ from each other along this dimension of arousal. But when Bain and Hovey they agree there are these different ways of being conscious, but when they call them modes, they're assuming they differ along multiple dimensions. Okay, so a mode is like a natural grouping of dimensions. A dimension is a way that consciousness can vary, and a level is a way to measure a dimension that comes in degrees. So this is the example of animal consciousness from the Birch paper. And here it's a hypothetical comparison of corvids, which include birds like crows, elephants, and cephalopods. And the dimensions are on the outside of the diagram. So that's perceptual richness, which has been broken into vision and touch, evaluative richness, and experience of unity, time, and the self. So they're the dimensions on the outside. And the levels here are these arbitrary numbers of 0 to 5. And the authors state that we can't have real numbers for these dimensions yet, but this diagram is based on the best current evidence. So the corvids, the orange shape, and they score highly on eyesight, but poorly on unity. And that's because these birds, the right and left hemisphere of the brain's not connected like us. The elephant scores poorly on eyesight, but well on unity. So the mode is going to be the shape. That orange shape is going to be how a corvid is going to be in the normal waking state. And later in the talk, I'll show a diagram like this where I compare different modes within humans. And I'll also try to show how psychosis doesn't seem to fit into a neat pattern or shape. Okay. So is psychosis a distinct mode of consciousness? I've mentioned what a mode is. It's a way of being conscious, like the normal waking state or REM sleep. And I've shown you this slide. These are the different dimensions of consciousness. These are what I'm testing for in my survey. The results, I'm not reporting those results in this talk, but I'll go into these dimensions in detail now. So level of arousal, I've already mentioned that the PCI and Glasgow Coma Scale are used by clinicians to track level of arousal in brain damaged patients. Contents. Contents include things like perceptions, sensations, emotions, and arguably more cognitive experiences, and they can vary in terms of their number. This is called the bandwidth. For example, psychological studies show that in the normal waking state, we normally have about 4 chunks of information in working memory, and a chunk is a collection of associated concepts. But we can have less of these when we're under anesthetic and more on psychedelics. Contents can also vary in terms of their quality. So in the normal waking state, perceptions are normally clear and distinct, but they're going to be degraded under anesthetic and heightened on psychedelics. Consciousness varies in terms of the structure, and this includes time, attention, unity in the self. So in the normal waking state, in terms of attention, we normally have things at the center of our attention and things on the periphery, but it's been suggested that if you use the drug ketamine, your attention will be spread evenly across the contents of consciousness. In terms of time, in the normal waking state, we normally experience time as a specious present, which means the present moment is extended for a few seconds, but this can slow down when you're bored, speed up when you're engrossed in something, and it can seem to stand still on LSD. In terms of unity, some philosophers argue that we experience consciousness in a unified way, and this seems to break down in split brain cases and in cases like dissociative identity disorder, which used to be known as multiple personality disorder. And in terms of the self, I won't go into this. The self is really a range of concepts, but in my survey, I tried to get an idea of an extended self or an autobiographical self, which is a more robust notion. In terms of function, this has to do with how the contents, how available they are to these consuming systems of the brain. And these take care of things like working memory, decision-making, verbal control, reporting, things like this. Okay, and so in the normal waking state, the contents are available to most of those systems, but they're not during REM sleep, for example. Okay, so if the normal waking state is a mode of consciousness, and this concept of a mode needs to be tested, but the assumption is that a mode is a grouping of these sort of dimensions. So if the normal waking state is a mode, then it would have a certain number of contents, like 4 chunks of information in working memory. These contents would be clear and distinct. We'd experience time as a specious present. The contents would be available to these consuming systems, etc. Now, if psychosis is a mode, it would also have a natural grouping of dimensions. And the way I'm going to try and answer this question in my PhD is by looking at part 1 of my online survey, which asks about 50 questions to do with those dimensions. I don't have that data at the moment, but I'm also looking at the interviews I'm doing, and that's what I'll report in this talk. So before I do that, this is a hypothetical profile of different modes within humans, and the dimensions I've used here are bandwidth, quality of content, spread of attention, the experience of unity, time, and the self. So the orange shape is the normal waking state, and the blue shape is what you'd expect for psychosis. So the idea is, if psychosis is a distinct mode, you'd expect this kind of natural grouping or this shape, where people have a similar experience along different dimensions. Okay, I'm going to read some quotes from the interviews I've done, where I explore how people experience. There are a couple, the interviews were open-ended, so I just asked people to describe their experiences to me, but I prompted them with a couple of questions about things I was interested in. And one question I asked was, when people were psychotic, did they realize they're in a different reality? And that's like saying, were they aware they weren't in the normal waking state, or that they're in a different mode? So this is a few responses to that. There wasn't a line in the sand where I could sort of think, well, this isn't normal. I just sort of slid into it, sort of thinking, oh, this is sort of the new normal. I definitely knew it wasn't the normal reality that everyone else probably was living in. But when the ideas were coming, it felt like it was a revelation. It's like the inner world is bigger than the outside world. It's sort of like you've gone within, you've gone somewhere else. Yeah, it was a sense of disconnection. It was like that sense of being disconnected from myself and from watching a different version of myself doing things in this weird alien environment of the hospital ward. That sense that this world is not quite real. This is not my real world. Am I a real person in this world, or am I a real person somewhere else? Am I even a real person? I also asked people if reality seemed different because perception and sensation were heightened, and these are some responses. Certainly, some of the things that I'm aware of as my mood starts to escalate is that a lot of my senses become a lot more heightened. When you say perception, heightened perception, see, I wouldn't say it was like a drug experience or anything. I'd say I was more manic and I was definitely moodier, but I don't think I recognize this as being, oh, wow, I can see things clearer, or you know what I mean? I didn't have any of that sort of thinking. I think everything's heightened. It just depends exactly what's going on. Even like, I think it's also motivation. I feel a lot more. When I'm in a heightened mood, I'm so much more motivated to do things. And it's because I feel the sensation so much more. So there's stuff that you feel, think, see, hear, sense that other people don't. So I have an awareness of that. I think it's an experience where things have sped up and you can't slow down, like a hyperdrive type of thing. So things will slow down around the threat and you'll become hyper-focused on the threat, and things will drop away that are not essential to that threat. I would say hyper-vigilant on the threat. I experience it as just overwhelming pressure, and it's the kind of pressure that just breaks you. It's just awful and unrelenting, and it's very hard to communicate it to anyone who hasn't experienced it. So there's a variety of responses there, and these are some themes that were mentioned in the interviews, not all of the in quotes that I just read out, but the themes I've got here are manic thoughts, heightened senses, heightened perception, heightened mood, extreme pressure, disconnection, inner world bigger than outer, and heightened motivation. And I did 8 interviews, but the highest number of people mentioning things here is heightened mood. There were 5 people mentioned that, and only 3 for manic thought, heightened senses, and heightened perceptions. And if psychosis was a distinct mode, you'd be expecting higher numbers converging on things here. But these themes are not the dimensions I'm testing for, but I'll compare these themes now in a diagram. I'll compare the participants using those themes. And I've used the arbitrary numbers of 2 to 5 here, where I've given someone a 3 if they didn't mention something and a 5 if they did. So I'll just go through this. Okay, that's participant 1 to 8 along those different themes. I'll do that one more time. Just comparing the participants. Okay. Now, again, this is not how my results will be reported in my thesis, because these themes I'm using here are not the same as the dimensions that I'm testing for, but this is really to motivate the claim that this is an interesting way to look at psychosis and to look at the variations in people's experiences. Okay, so I'll end with some thoughts on this. The preliminary results suggest that psychosis is not a distinct mode. This is not meant to be, these are just preliminary results. They're not conclusive at all. but they're based on 8 one-hour interviews. And I asked people, did they recognize they're in a different reality? And did reality seem different because perception and sensation were heightened? And people varied in their responses to that. So in terms of people realizing they're in a different reality, that's like saying, were they aware they're not in the normal waking state or in a different mode? I'm not assuming psychosis is a distinct mode, but I do assume it's different to the normal waking state. So to say psychosis is a distinct mode is to say that everyone's going to have this natural grouping of dimensions, and that may not be the case. Why people are not aware they're not in the normal waking state, I don't know the answer to that. It could have something to do with access to memory. I'm not really looking for causes. I'm more interested in the fact that there are different responses to this. And the fact that we don't always realize when we're not in a mode, like, for example, unless you're in lucid dreaming, you're not aware when you're in REM sleep. And if you're under light anesthetic, you may or may not be aware you're not in the normal waking state. And different drugs vary depending on the person and the amount of drug. So someone could be drunk and be unaware that they're drunk. So they lack self-awareness, but their experience is going to be qualitatively different to the normal waking state. And then is people asking people if reality seemed different because perception and sensation seemed heightened. There were different responses. Some people agreed with this. Some people highlighted other aspects of their experience, like heightened mood, manic thoughts, heightened feelings of pressure. And these may not necessarily be things I'm testing for. The reason that there are different, that the different responses suggest that psychosis is not a distinct mode, but some of my participants have bipolar disorder, some have schizophrenia. So could ask, do these different classifications lead to different responses? This doesn't seem to be the case, but it would require further investigation. Alternatively, if my results turn out that there are different clumpings of responses, it could be suggestive of new ways to classify these disorders. Just briefly, the argument for psychosis not being a distinct mode. If psychosis were a distinct mode, it would consist of a normal, a natural grouping of dimensions distinct from the normal waking state. Psychosis does not consist of such a grouping, therefore psychosis is not a distinct mode. The significance, as I've mentioned, it may suggest new ways to classify these disorders. These disorders may suggest new directions to look for biological markers, which could have implications for treatment. And this work could determine the usefulness of the concept of a mode and whether psychosis is a distinct mode. In terms of the limitation, this is a very small sample size and it's not meant to be conclusive, as I've said, these results. They're just motivating this line of research. Also, I didn't ask each participant about all those themes I used. They were open-ended interviews and these were just themes that came out of those conversations. So people's experiences may have been more alike than my findings suggest. And yes, future research will be relying on the quantitative research of the surveys as well as this online survey. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay.